A while ago I made a video on cross-country bikes versus trail bikes, and that video has been pretty popular, and even after that video I still get a lot of questions on what bike should I choose. So what I'm going to do here is I've spent the last couple weeks switching off and on between my trail bike and my cross-country bike. And my bikes right behind me here are a Giant Anthem and a Giant Trance. Two bikes perfectly suited for those categories. So the Anthem's a perfect classic cross-country bike, great for racing or just riding fast, and the Trance is just a perfect 27.5 trail bike with 650B or 27.5 wheels and with 140 millimeters of travel. So when I was doing this, I kind of was asking myself the question that I get from a lot of people, and that is, if you could have one bike, what would you choose? So that's how I went into this. And so again, over the couple weeks, I just took some notes of kind of what the bikes feel like. So that's what this video is going to be about. It's just going to be a chat with you guys about the difference between these two bikes, and mainly focusing on the ride characteristics. The first video I made was I went into the mechanics of the difference between a cross-country bike and a trail bike. And if you haven't seen that, go back and watch that, because I kind of just drill into the differences mechanically between the two. But this one is going to be more of just a chat about the ride characteristics. When I jump on one bike after being on the other for a while, it takes me about 20 minutes to get used to the way the bike rides and really just be able to ride it hard the way it's meant to be ridden. If I have a race coming up, I'll spend 2, 3 or more rides on the cross-country bike just to really get the feel of the bike. And it's that feeling of being one with the bike, just knowing exactly how it's going to handle, how it's going to brake, how it's going to accelerate out of a corner. On the other hand, if I have a trip coming up, and that's what I use my trail bike a lot for, because I ride in pretty flat terrain, and a trail bike is a little overkill for what I ride, but I still really enjoy it, and I'm going to talk about that in this video. But if I have a trip coming up, I'll spend 3 or 4 rides on the trail bike just so I can get used to it. So when I get up in the mountains and hit the first downhill, I really have a good feeling of how the bike's going to ride. So here are some notes that I took when I jumped on each bike. So the first time I get back on the cross-country bike, my first thought is, man, this bike feels twitchy. And then after about 20-30 minutes on the bike, I think, man, this bike is fast. And so let's talk about the cross-country bike. The front end feel is the most noticeable characteristic of both bikes. So the cross-country bike, you feel like you're over the front end, and you feel like you're leaning more over the front end, and it has that what I call shopping cart steering. If you push a shopping cart or a buggy around the grocery store, and it's just real twitchy. Those little wheels just you can switch the cart real quick, but if you feel like you ride the cart like I do in the parking lot, it just feels twitchy. So that's what the cross-country bike feels like. Again, the front end, it feels like you're lower, and it feels like you're driving the front end into the trail more, which is good when you're hitting a corner fast, but it's bad if you're riding really rough, steep terrain. If you feel like your weight is way over the front end and you can drive that wheel into rocks and roots, it can make the bike feel sketchy. And so that's one thing that I noticed. On the cross-country bike, it obviously, because of that twitchiness, it does switch lines really quick. So you can just go from one corner to another super fast on the cross-country bike. I do notice when I jump back on the cross-country bike, it feels bumpy. Like it just feels, you just feel the bumps in the trail. And it's probably not groundbreaking news. But if you're looking for a bike that's just smooth, like maybe you have back problems, or you just like cruising more and feeling that plush ride, then the trail bike is more of the kind of bike that rides like that. The cross-country bike acceleration, I mean, that's, in racing, you're accelerating fast out of corners, covering an attack, that kind of thing. And so the acceleration on the cross-country bike is one of the things that I notice. And A couple reasons for that. One is the weight. My cross-country bike weighs 24 pounds with pedals. My trail bike weighs about 30 pounds with pedals. So the weight's one factor. The other factor is the suspension. So even though the trail bike has Maestro suspension, it's still, just sinks down a little bit when you pedal. It's not bad. It's not near as bad as other bikes that I've ridden, but the suspension does bounce on the front and the rear, and that will cause the bike to not accelerate quite as fast. But you just got to be smoother. I can make my trail bike accelerate pretty fast. You just need to do it smoothly. You can't just hop out of the saddle and sprint like you can on a cross-country bike. The cross-country bike just doesn't feel like it floats over the trail. I'd say the cross-country bike takes more precision to ride. Your riding skills need to be honed a little bit better on a cross-country bike because you cannot get lazy. You just have to give it more attention. You can't relax as much on a cross-country bike if the terrain is kind of rugged and steep. And you can't get lazy because things can go south on you real quick on a cross-country bike. You feel like the terrain could cause the bike to just get off its line quicker on a cross-country bike. You don't feel like you have as much control over the front end on a cross-country bike. So again, you just have to give it more attention, and it just takes more finesse to ride a cross-country bike. You've got to pay more attention to your lines. You have to, instead of plowing over rocks or something like that, sometimes you have to do the J-hop, the front end, rear end over the rock. Whereas on a trail bike, you could plow into it. I mean, you can't plow into boulders or anything, but you can just get a little bit more relaxed on a trail bike than you can on a cross-country bike. And so, with that, you can't say that one is more fun than the other because, some people enjoy having to pick your lines a little bit more and having to, finesse the bike more over rough stuff. That type of riding is fun. But of course, on a trail bike, it's also fun just to, just fly over stuff. So I'll get into that on the trail bike. The analogy that I use is a motorcycle. A cross-country bike feels like a crotch rocket. Accelerates fast, brakes fast, although trail bike brakes fast too, but it just corners quicker. Whereas a trail bike is more of a sport tourer. It's just designed to handle rougher stuff, and you can just kind of relax more, and the geometry just feels more comfortable. So when I jump back on the trail bike, my first thought is, this bike feels slow. It feels a little sluggish. And then after about 20 minutes, my thought is, man, this bike is fun to ride. And again, it's the front end feel. It's the first thing that you notice when you go between the bikes. So the front end on the trail bike, it's funny, when you're riding a trail bike just on the pavement or just on a flat, trail, you feel like when you let off the pedals, it rolls better. It's kind of an illusion kind of thing because your weight is up more and the front wheel is just kind of floating out there a little better, and it just feels like you're floating more and the bike cruises easier. It's a unique feel, but your weight is not as far forward. You're not leaning over the front end like you are on a cross-country bike, and so that gives the front end the feel of it's floating. The steering on the cross-country bike at slow speeds, it feels heavy, like the bike will flop into a turn. But the great thing about trail bikes is the faster you go, the more fun they are to ride. What feels maybe sluggish at slow speeds becomes a lot more agile at faster speeds, but it's more stable. If you're going really fast on a cross-country bike on a steep descent or something that's pretty rough, the bike gets even more twitchy. But trail bikes are designed so that at fast speeds going downhill, the bike is still stable and you can still control it. So obviously, on a downhill, a trail bike is just a blast to ride. I call it diving into corners, and that's the funnest thing for me sometimes on a trail bike, whether it's a berm or maybe a corner that just kind of drops down. You get this feeling that you can attack the corner. Even on trails that aren't as rough, like my trails around here that are flatter, I just feel like I can attack corners harder on the trail bike. And there's a few reasons for that. One is the geometry. Just that slacker geometry makes the bike more stable. So when you're just hammering into a corner, you don't feel like the front wheel will just start moving around. So the steering, you're just able to hold the steering a lot better on a trail bike than you can on a cross-country bike. Even when you're leaned into a corner on a cross-country bike, because the head angle is steeper, you still feel like the bars can move around in a corner. That's why I said you've got to really give it a lot of attention on a cross-country bike. You can't get lazy. On a trail bike, you feel like the bars are just going to hold that line as you're cornering. So that's why I say it feels like you can just attack a corner. The other reason is the tires. I mean, you've got wider tires on a trail bike, and usually you've got more knobs or bigger knobs on a trail bike tire. A trail bike, I noticed that it's just easier to recover. So if you do get a little squirrely on a section, you're going to be able to pull out of that easier on a trail bike than you can on a cross-country bike. As far as speed, trail bikes aren't a ton slower than cross-country bikes, but that kind of depends on the travel. You can get trail bikes that are 120 millimeters of travel, and you can get trail bikes that are 150, 160. So the lower the travel, usually the lower the weight, the steeper the geometry, and so those are going to be faster. But I did a time section on my trail bike and cross-country bike last week, and it was about 14.5 minutes long, and I think I was 30 to 40 seconds slower on the trail bike. So it's not like there's a night and day difference between the two. It's the climbs where a trail bike can kind of drag a little bit because of the weight. So a long climb, steep climb, you're just going to have to work a little bit harder on a trail bike. But when the climbs are rough and you've got to get more traction to get up stuff, trail bikes, the travel just absorbs the stuff better, so you can actually get more traction on climbs. My trail bike has Stans flow wheels on it, and I actually set a Strava KOM up in the North Georgia mountains on my trail bike. Now, obviously, cross-country guys haven't really got out there and attacked that climb, but that's just to say you can climb pretty good on a trail bike. Another characteristic that I noticed when I get back on the trail bike, and I mentioned this a little bit before, but is just how plush the bike feels. Whereas a cross-country bike, I ride full suspension cross-country, and so this kind of has to do with full suspension. But on the cross-country bike, it softens a lot of the roots and rocks and stuff. On a trail bike, you feel like it just completely absorbs it, and it's really fun to have that feeling of the suspension just sinking down into that travel and absorbing G-outs or holes or roots or rocks. And especially when you're flying down a hill on a trail bike, to feel the suspension just kind of stay glued to the trail better on a trail bike, it's a great feeling, and it also gives you a lot of confidence in braking, because the more your tire is on the ground, the more you can brake hard on a rough descent. On a cross-country bike, you feel like the bike's kind of skipping on top of the terrain better, and so the rougher it is, the less traction you're going to have on a cross-country bike. So now that brings us to the question of which bike would I choose if I had to choose one bike. And I want to answer this question to help you all out there who you're probably in a position where you can't afford more than one bike right now, or you may just want to go all in on one nice bike. So you don't want to have two lesser expensive bikes, but you want to go in on maybe a carbon trail bike or a carbon cross-country bike and just kind of focus on the one bike. I have kind of what I call a Jekyll and Hyde type of personality when it comes to mountain biking. On one hand, I love just pushing it hard, doing Strava segments, doing races. And you can get into just this flow on a cross-country bike where you're just accelerating hard out of a corner. You know, you're just in that flow of going from turn to turn, braking hard, you know, accelerating. So I love that style of riding, whether it's a race or I'm just out training or out doing a Strava segment. On the other hand, I love just putting on my baggy shorts, my baggy jersey, and just not caring at all about the clock, and just going out having fun, bombing descents, you know, doing jumps and drops. I don't go crazy on jumps, but just going out and having fun on a mountain bike. And I don't race cross country as much as I used to. Now I'm focusing more on cyclocross because it's what my kids enjoy more, and so it's good family time. So I'm doing more cross racing. So sometimes I just want to save the hard riding for the road bike or the cross country bike or the cyclocross bike, and then just have fun on a mountain bike. But there are times when I just love getting out on my cross country bike and hammering. So for me personally, if I had to choose one bike, I would go with a cross country bike, but I would put a longer fork on. And that's why I really like the Giant Anthem SX. I think Giant did a good job. And other bike companies are doing this and putting a little bit longer travel fork on a cross country bike. Because of where I live, that probably has a lot to do with it. And also, I still like going out and riding hard. Doing Strava segments really helps me train for my cyclocross racing. Just gives me motivation. It's a lot better than going out and doing intervals on the road. I do that, but I prefer doing Strava segments on my cross-country bike. So for me personally, I would go for the cross-country bike. If you don't care at all about the clock or keeping up with fast guys on cross-country bikes, a trail bike is going to be more versatile. I can ride my trail bike around here on my flatter terrain and have just as much fun usually as I would on my cross-country bike, again, if I'm not trying to beat a Strava segment. So a trail bike is more versatile, and then I can take the thing up into the mountains and just have a blast. So if you want a bike that's really versatile and you don't race, again, you don't care about the clock, then I would say go for a trail bike. They're just a lot of fun. Let me throw one comment in here about wheel size. I haven't really talked about wheel size. I think for trail bikes, 27.5 is one of the best wheel sizes, unless you want a short travel bike. If you want like a 120, 29ers are nice. For cross country, it's going to depend on your type of terrain, your style of riding. I'm not really going to go into that on this video, but I will say that a full suspension 29er cross country bike is a little bit more versatile than a 27.5 cross country bike, unless you put the 120 fork on a 27.5. A 29er full suspension is more stable. For me, it's not as fast, it's not as agile as my 27.5. It doesn't accelerate as fast, but it is more stable. So to me, a 29er full suspension, something like a Specialized Epic or a Trek, the Superfly, or the Giant Anthem 29er. Those bikes are, to me, it's just a pretty versatile bike. They're pretty fast on a cross-country course, really fast actually, but they're a little bit more stable. So that's a nice option if you're kind of going to the one bike scenario. Let me also make a comment about having one bike or two. On one hand, it's nice being able to have the versatility, and that's why I love owning two bikes, because even living in riding the same trails over and over, they feel different on both bikes, and so that's one reason I like having two bikes. On the other hand, having one bike is nice. One, because it saves you money and you can just focus on maintaining that one bike, but you really get, if you stay on a bike, you really get used to it, and you can just ride that bike really hard. So, it's not a bad thing having just one bike if you can make it kind of versatile and kind of adapt it to the trails you ride most. And I had mentioned, kind of going all in on one bike, and that's another consideration. There are some mega expensive mountain bikes out there, like $9,000-$10,000 trail bikes or $9,000 to $10,000 cross country bikes. For me personally, that's ludicrous. to spend that much money on a mountain bike. As much as I love mountain biking, the advantages you get from going from a $5,000 to a $10,000 mountain bike are small. There's no way I would have one bike that costs that much. I would definitely split it into two. And that's why, you know, both my bikes are not super expensive. I have aluminum frames, although I'm really thinking about upgrading to the carbon Anthem this year. I'm kind of weighing that out. But you know, for me personally, I wouldn't go all in and spend crazy amounts of money on a mountain bike. I'd much rather have two bikes. You know, a $4,000 trail bike is, you know, you can get an awesome trail bike for $4,000 or $3,000. And same with cross country. I mean, for, you know, $4,000, you know, you can have an awesome cross country bike, full suspension. Hardtails are a little bit less. So there's all kind of things that you can take into consideration with that. So I'm going to wrap up the video, and again, I hope this discussion was helpful for you guys out there, you girls out there who are looking for, you know, a new bike and trying to make that decision between a cross country bike or a trail bike, because as you can see, like I said, there's a lot of factors to consider. And it's going to really come down to what you want out of mountain biking. So again, if you've not watched the other video that I've done, cross country versus trail, go back and watch that. That goes into the mechanics of the different bikes. Thanks for watching.